There are seasons in life when the soul leans forward with longing, stretching itself toward heaven in the hope of hearing something, a word, a whisper, even a sense of presence. And yet, what meets that reaching is not a reply, but a stillness so complete it feels like the entire sky has stopped listening. It is in these moments, when we offer up our prayers with trembling sincerity, that the silence arrives, not as an empty space, but as something far heavier, something that settles deep and slow, asking questions without forming words. We speak with earnest hearts, calling out with phrases shaped by hope and wounds alike. And what returns is not noise, nor comfort, nor rebuke, only quiet. And though the world continues its rhythms, voices on the street, movement in the trees, the ordinary hum of passing time, our inner world feels suspended, as though held in a room where no answers are given and the waiting stretches farther than the eye can see. This quiet is not merely the absence of sound. It carries a weight that touches every part of us. It causes the spirit to search itself again and again, turning over memories, intentions, mistakes, and longings, wondering where the connection slipped out of reach. It awakens a deeper thirst, not for blessings, not for miracles, but for a sense that someone is near, watching, caring, remaining close even without speaking. In those times, the heart does not cry out for explanation. It reaches for companionship, for the assurance that even in the places where language has grown still, the relationship has not faded. The soul does not demand thunder from heaven. It longs for the steady presence of a friend who sees everything and chooses to stay. What often remains hidden during these stretches of sacred quiet is the truth that the silence itself holds a form of communication too subtle for words. The stillness does not arrive to accuse, nor to punish, nor to abandon. It arrives to deepen. It creates space for the soul to lean in, not with striving or performance, but with simple presence and reverent awareness. Many of the stories written in Scripture were not shaped in the middle of triumph or clarity, but in the slow unfolding of quiet days and unremarkable nights. Moses tended sheep in the backside of the desert long before he heard a voice from a burning bush. Hannah whispered prayers with trembling lips before her womb was opened. David composed songs in caves long before he held a crown. Their seasons of quiet were not wasted. They became the foundation from which deep knowing emerged. It is in the slow rhythm of unseen days that trust is formed, not the kind of trust that feeds on constant affirmation, but the kind that roots itself in something deeper than answers. This trust matures not in the brightness of revelation, but in the long shadows of patience, where nothing seems to move, and yet everything is being formed. When we find ourselves in a place where God's voice is not easily heard, we are invited not to perform, nor to strive, nor to question our worth, but to remain. Remaining becomes the greatest expression of love, not because it is easy, but because it believes that presence exists even when it is not perceived. Faith, in its strongest form, is not a feeling of confidence. It is a quiet decision to stay connected, to keep walking, to continue reaching even when nothing echoes back. Sometimes the most transformative work of God does not come wrapped in emotion or insight or breakthrough. Sometimes it takes shape in the soul's quiet agreement to stay near even when the sky feels mute. In those moments, something sacred is being written, not in the form of sentences, but in the posture of the heart. The quiet seasons are not empty. They are full of mystery and forming. They are where our expectations are softened, our demands are loosened, and our awareness is sharpened. What felt like delay is often preparation. What felt like distance is sometimes the rearranging of the soul to hold something it could not yet carry. Though we may enter these seasons with uncertainty, they often become the places we remember most. We remember the slowness, the ache, the stillness, not because of what we received, but because of who we became while waiting. We became listeners. We became watchers. We became those who did not give up when the answers didn't come quickly, but who learned to dwell in the sacredness of unanswered space. And in time, not according to our calendar, but according to grace, there comes a moment when the silence changes tone. It may not shout, it may not even speak aloud, but something shifts. A warmth returns to the edge of awareness. A clarity begins to form in the quiet corners of the soul. And suddenly, we realize that the silence was not void, but full of God's breath, held gently just beyond the veil, waiting until our hearts were ready to receive not just His words, but His very being. So, if today you find yourself in that still and heavy place, wondering whether the heavens have forgotten your name, take this to heart. You are not left behind. You are not overlooked. You are in the quiet center of a process far deeper than noise could ever carry. And though it may not feel like it, though the waiting stretches longer than you imagined, something holy is happening. Something that will only be understood in the fullness of time. Remain. Listen. Trust. The silence does not separate you from God. It is shaping you for the day when His voice will return, and you will be ready to recognize it with more reverence, more tenderness, more awe than ever before. There is a moment in the story of Jesus that lingers like a quiet echo, a moment not filled with miracles, nor with teaching, nor with the stirring crowds that often surrounded Him, but with a silence so steady, so deliberate, that it almost feels out of place. As He stood before Pilate, with the weight of injustice pressing heavily against Him, He offered no defense. The very Word through whom the universe was formed chose, in that moment, to remain silent. This silence was not hesitation, nor confusion, nor defeat. It was a silence filled with authority, woven with a strength that did not depend on noise. And it teaches us something that words cannot, that the quiet spaces in our story may hold a sacred kind of power, a deeper kind of obedience, a trust that does not require immediate understanding. In the waiting room of suffering, Jesus stood still. He did not rush to explain nor argue his innocence. He did not plead for sympathy nor fight to escape what was unfolding. He remained, eyes open, heart steady, holding within himself the peace that surpasses all human defenses. And in doing so, he revealed that trust is not always loud, and that purpose is not always wrapped in movement. Many of us struggle when we find ourselves in a season that feels like waiting, the kind of days where time drips slowly, where prayers seem to dissolve before they rise, where outcomes remain uncertain and doors stay closed without explanation. In these moments, we search for signs, for signals, for any indication that God is still present and still working. And when those signals are slow to come, the silence can begin to feel like abandonment. But the story of Jesus tells us something different. It tells us that silence can be full of presence, that delay can be part of the design, that stillness can be the very soil in which surrender takes root. When he stood quiet before those who would condemn him, he was not powerless. He was perfectly aligned with the will of the Father, and that alignment required not a voice, but a willingness to remain. There are seasons when we are asked to do the same, seasons in which we are not called to act, nor to prove, nor to push forward, but simply to wait. And the waiting is not a punishment. It is a space of holy preparation, a time in which the soul is taught to rely not on sensation, but on truth, a truth that does not shift with feelings and does not require explanation to be real. In the hidden moments between what was and what will be, Jesus teaches us that the waiting room is not empty. It is occupied by the very presence of God, who is not distant, but quietly shaping the future in ways we cannot yet perceive. And while our natural instinct is to move, to fix, to seek resolution, there is a higher invitation. The invitation to rest in the same posture Christ took when he faced the weight of injustice and pain, without needing to fill the silence with answers. The stillness that surrounded Jesus in those final hours was not a sign of defeat, but of depth. It revealed the maturity of a heart fully given, a heart that trusted the Father's plan, even when that plan led through suffering. And in that trust, there was beauty, a beauty not defined by outcome, but by surrender. When we find ourselves waiting, unsure of what comes next, longing for clarity and comfort, we can return to this moment in the Gospels and find companionship there. We are not the first to wait in silence. We are not the first to stand in a place where the heavens seem quiet and the path ahead is hidden. Jesus stood there first, not only as a savior, but as a companion,
one who understands what it is to wait without visible signs, and to love without visible reward. This kind of waiting is not passive. It is an act of faith. It is a declaration that we believe in promises not yet fulfilled, in answers not yet spoken, in a shepherd whose timing is perfect even when his footsteps cannot be heard. And in that act, something begins to change within us. We become people who do not live by impulse or fear, but by a quiet, anchored trust, the kind of trust that changes everything, not by removing the waiting, but by filling it with meaning. So if you are in that waiting room today, sitting quietly with questions that have not yet found their shape, know that you are not forgotten. You are not misplaced. You are where many have stood before you, including the one who loved perfectly and waited completely. And in that space, even without words, God is near. The waiting is not wasted. It is where your soul learns the language of stillness. It is where you are taught to recognize the sound of grace without noise. It is where you become like Him. There are paths the soul must walk alone, not because others have abandoned us, nor because we have stepped away from love, but because there are places in the heart that can only be formed in solitude. These are not empty places, though at first they may seem like barren ground. They are places of depth, carved slowly by seasons of silence, shaped by questions too sacred to be answered quickly. Faith often begins in company, nurtured by voices, carried by songs, strengthened by shared prayer. But at some point, it must learn to stand on its own, to walk through stretches of wilderness where nothing familiar remains. It is here, where comfort fades and echoes disappear, that trust begins to deepen beyond surface understanding. It is here that belief becomes something more than agreement. It becomes a place we live from, not because of what surrounds us, but because of what holds us within. The wilderness is not the place where God withdraws. It is the place where distractions fall away, where noise becomes stillness, where we learn to listen not for answers, but for presence. In this silence, the soul discovers that God is not confined to feeling, and that communion is not always accompanied by sensation. There is a sacredness in being alone with Him, a knowing that does not depend on sight, a closeness that grows not through explanation, but through continued nearness. Many of the ones we honor in the stories of Scripture passed through this wilderness. Moses found his calling in the loneliness of the desert. Elijah heard the whisper of God only after the fire and wind had passed. John the Baptist prepared the way not from the temple, but from the still spaces beyond the city's walls. Even Jesus withdrew often into solitude, not to escape, but to abide more fully. These moments of separation do not remove us from the story. They deepen our role in it. They teach us that faith is not only for the light-filled days, it is for the shadowed valleys, for the stretches of landscape where nothing grows quickly, where each step feels slow and deliberate, and where the only sound is the quiet rhythm of our own heartbeat, reminding us that we are still here, still walking, still held. In the silence of the wilderness, the soul begins to remember something ancient, a truth that breathes beneath the noise of modern life. That God does not rush transformation. That intimacy with Him is often forged in the long stillness of unspoken trust. That when we are stripped of our reliance on others to carry our faith, we are invited into a more personal, more enduring relationship with the one who carries us. Loneliness, in this sense, is not a void. It becomes a kind of sanctuary, a hidden place where God meets us without pretense, without performance. It becomes the place where we stop trying to prove our faith and begin to receive it as something that is given, something that grows not from striving, but from surrender. This is not the loneliness of abandonment. It is the solitude of sacred attention. It is the still ground where roots stretch downward, reaching for waters unseen, anchoring us in the truth that our worth is not dependent on how seen we are, but on how known we are by the one who formed us. When faith feels like loneliness, it is not because something has gone wrong. It is often because something has begun to go deeper. And though the surface may feel silent, something holy is unfolding, slow, invisible, but real. If you find yourself in that quiet stretch, where friends are few, where words have grown thin, where prayers feel as though they float unanswered, hold fast to the truth that solitude is not separation. The desert is not desolation, and faith that learns to breathe in such places will carry a weight and tenderness that cannot be taken away. You are not losing faith in the wilderness. You are discovering what faith truly is.
There are paths the soul must walk alone, not because others have abandoned us, nor because we have stepped away from love, but because there are places in the heart that can only be formed in solitude. These are not empty places, though at first they may seem like barren ground. They are places of depth, carved slowly by seasons of silence, shaped by questions too sacred to be answered quickly. Faith often begins in company, nurtured by voices, carried by songs, strengthened by shared prayer. But at some point, it must learn to stand on its own, to walk through stretches of wilderness where nothing familiar remains. It is here, where comfort fades and echoes disappear, that trust begins to deepen beyond surface understanding. It is here that belief becomes something more than agreement. It becomes a place we live from, not because of what surrounds us, but because of what holds us within. The wilderness is not the place where God withdraws. It is the place where distractions fall away, where noise becomes stillness, where we learn to listen not for answers, but for presence. In this silence, the soul discovers that God is not confined to feeling, and that communion is not always accompanied by sensation. There is a sacredness in being alone with Him, a knowing that does not depend on sight, a closeness that grows not through explanation, but through continued nearness. Many of the ones we honor in the stories of Scripture passed through this wilderness. Moses found his calling in the loneliness of the desert. Elijah heard the whisper of God only after the fire and wind had passed. John the Baptist prepared the way not from the temple, but from the still spaces beyond the city's walls. Even Jesus withdrew often into solitude, not to escape, but to abide more fully. These moments of separation do not remove us from the story. They deepen our role in it. They teach us that faith is not only for the light-filled days, it is for the shadowed valleys, for the stretches of landscape where nothing grows quickly, where each step feels slow and deliberate, and where the only sound is the quiet rhythm of our own heartbeat, reminding us that we are still here, still walking, still held.
In the silence of the wilderness, the soul begins to remember something ancient, a truth that breathes beneath the noise of modern life, that God does not rush transformation, that intimacy with Him is often forged in the long stillness of unspoken trust, that when we are stripped of our reliance on others to carry our faith, we are invited into a more personal, more enduring relationship with the one who carries us. Loneliness, in this sense, is not a void. It becomes a kind of sanctuary, a hidden place where God meets us without pretense, without performance. It becomes the place where we stop trying to prove our faith and begin to receive it as something that is given, something that grows not from striving, but from surrender. This is not the loneliness of abandonment. It is the solitude of sacred attention. It is the still ground where roots stretch downward, reaching for waters unseen, anchoring us in the truth that our worth is not dependent on how seen we are, but on how known we are by the one who formed us. When faith feels like loneliness, it is not because something has gone wrong. It is often because something has begun to go deeper. And though the surface may feel silent, something holy is unfolding, slow, invisible, but real. If you find yourself in that quiet stretch where friends are few, where words have grown thin, where prayers feel as though they float unanswered, hold fast to the truth that solitude is not separation. The desert is not desolation, and faith that learns to breathe in such places will carry a weight and tenderness that cannot be taken away. You are not losing faith in the wilderness. You are discovering what faith truly is.
There is a rhythm to how God prepares those He intends to use deeply. A rhythm that rarely begins in crowded places, nor in moments of applause, but in quiet landscapes where the soul is made ready through stillness, where hearts are stripped of striving, and where clarity grows not through noise, but through long and faithful waiting. These are not detours, they are sacred routes often unmarked by recognition, yet rich with the fingerprints of purpose. When we looked through the stories of those whose lives carried great weight in God's plan, we find a shared experience that threads their journeys together. It is the wilderness, not as punishment nor as exile, but as a place of refining, of revealing, of returning to the essence of who we are when everything else is removed. In this place, God speaks in ways that are not always loud, but always lasting. Moses, once a prince of Egypt, found himself among sheep and sand, far from palaces, far from praise. It was there, in the silence of obscurity, that something began to shift. No longer was he the man defined by past mistakes or former titles. In that wilderness, identity was reshaped through encounter. And it was through the quiet of his ordinary days that a bush began to burn, not with destruction, but with divine appointment. The voice he heard there did not call him to return to glory. It called him to obedience, steady, humble, costly. Even Elijah, a prophet once filled with the fire of confrontation, reached the end of himself beneath a broom tree, weary from the weight of his calling. He walked into the wilderness, not seeking revelation, but rest. And it was there, in the cave where shadows gathered, that he heard the voice of God, not in the earthquake, nor in the fire, nor in the wind, but in the sound of gentle stillness. That whisper did not accuse. It reminded him that he was not alone, that his journey was not finished, and that God still had more for him than the exhaustion he carried. Even Jesus, before he preached, before he healed, before he called disciples, was led into the wilderness. It was not the crowd that met him there, but hunger and testing. Yet in that place, where human strength grew thin, the depth of his trust became visible. He answered not with defiance, but with words anchored in the eternal. And when he returned, he did not come back empty. He came with clarity, with authority, with the quiet confidence of one who had walked with the Father when no one else was watching.
These stories teach us that the wilderness is not a backdrop of silence. It is a classroom. And the lessons learned there are never rushed, because God is not in a hurry when He is forming something eternal. In the wilderness, we learn to distinguish between noise and voice, between movement and meaning, between survival and surrender. We learn that presence does not always come with sensation, and that God does not withdraw simply because He is quiet. The wilderness teaches patience, but more than that, it teaches presence. How to abide without performing, how to listen without demanding, how to trust without knowing the outcome. These are not lessons for the shallow places of life. They are for the foundations. They are for those whose calling will require more than charisma, more than momentary courage. They are for those who must be grounded enough to stand in storms and silent enough to hear the whisper beneath the wind. What these journeys reveal is that God never wastes the wilderness. Every quiet hour, every dry season, every unanswered prayer, they become the soil where resilience grows, where humility deepens, and where vision expands beyond what comfort could ever produce. And while the path through such places may feel slow, it is in that slowness that something unshakable is built. If today you find yourself in a stretch of life that feels wide and empty, where answers are few and clarity is distant, remember that this place has been walked before. It has been walked by the faithful. It has been walked by the fearful. It has been walked by the Son of God Himself. And it was there, in that silent terrain, that something holy always began. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are being formed, slowly, gently, deeply. And what is growing now, in secret, will one day speak with quiet power into the lives of others who are still learning how to wait.
There are moments when life gathers its strength like a rising wind. Moments when all that once felt stable begins to tremble, when the world tilts in ways we did not expect, and the air itself seems thick with questions. Storms do not always arrive with warning. Sometimes they come quietly, hidden in a sentence, a diagnosis, a departure, a door that closes too soon. And when they do, we brace ourselves, hoping to stand, hoping to last, hoping to hear something from heaven that will anchor us through the noise. But often, what follows the storm is not the voice we imagined. It is not the dramatic response we longed for, nor the thunderous clarity we believed we needed. It is something smaller, something softer, something so quiet it would be easy to miss. After the wind has passed, after the fire has burned, after the earth has shaken, there is a hush. And within that hush, a whisper begins. This was the experience of Elijah, a man who had seen God send fire from heaven, who had stood alone on Mount Carmel with a heart full of zeal, and who now found himself in a cave, worn thin from fear and fatigue. He had expected the voice of God to match the drama of his circumstances, to speak in thunder, to arrive in force. But what met him instead was a sound so gentle, so still, that it could only be heard by a heart made quiet. The whisper did not command, it did not accuse. It carried no volume, yet it carried weight, the kind of weight that settles into the soul and shifts it from the inside out. This was not the whisper of correction, but of nearness. It was not the voice of distance, but of invitation. It was God drawing close in a way that only stillness allows. There is a reason the whisper waits until after the storm. It is because we are rarely ready to hear it before. The noise outside often mirrors the noise within, and the soul, until it is emptied of resistance, cannot truly receive what requires silence to be heard. The whisper does not compete. It remains. It waits. It arrives only when the heart has made room for something deeper than rescue, something closer to presence.
The whisper is how God speaks when He wants us to listen differently. It is how He reveals Himself not through might, but through mercy. It is how He reminds us that His power is not limited to what is loud. It flows through what is light. And that kind of power transforms, not through force, but through love. In a world filled with shouting, with headlines, with urgency, the whisper of God remains unchanged. It does not chase our attention. It waits for it. And in that waiting, it teaches us to lower our defenses, to soften our pace, to draw near without demand. The whisper does not instruct from afar. It leans close, so that in order to hear it, we must do the same. When the storm has passed, when the questions still hang in the air, when the ground is soaked with what we've lost and what we no longer understand, that is the moment when the whisper arrives, not as exclamation, but as companionship, not as solution, but as presence. And in that presence, something sacred begins to root, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, and a love that does not require performance. The whisper after the storm is not just a voice, it is a promise. It is the voice of the one who remained when everything else fell silent. It is the voice that says, "I see you. I have not left. I am still here." If you are in the quiet that comes after shaking, if the chaos has finally settled, and now all you hear is the space that remains, do not fear that emptiness. That space is holy. It is the place where God speaks with the kind of tenderness that cannot be forced. It is the place where the soul hears not just what is said, but who is speaking. And that voice, that whisper, carries enough strength to begin again.
There is a longing within us for things to unfold quickly, for prayers to be answered swiftly, for doors to open the moment we knock, for healing to arrive as soon as the ache appears. We are shaped by a rhythm that measures time through urgency, that equates waiting with absence, and that quietly believes that delays means something has gone wrong. Yet the deeper wisdom of God flows with a different current, one that does not rush toward outcomes, but carefully prepares us for them. God's timing often stretches beyond our understanding, not because He is distant, but because He sees more than we can. His view is not bound by days or calendars. He sees the whole story, held in eternal clarity, and His movements are not measured by our clocks, but by the readiness of the soil He's been softening in silence. When God waits, it is never careless. It is never indifferent. His pauses are intentional, filled with purpose, even when that purpose remains hidden. He does not withhold out of reluctance. He unfolds things in a way that honors the fullness of what He is doing, not only around us, but within us. Scripture gives us glimpses of this quiet unfolding. Abraham waited years before the promise of a son became reality. Joseph endured betrayal, imprisonment, and years of silence before stepping into his purpose.
David was anointed king as a shepherd boy, but walked through caves and conflict before he ever touched the crown. Each of them walked a road shaped by divine patience, and in that shaping they were prepared to carry the weight of what was coming. Waiting is not passive. It is active trust. It is the space where our need for control is gently released, where our assumptions are softened, where our hearts are trained to listen more than demand. In waiting, faith grows deeper roots, not because we understand more, but because we surrender more. We begin to discover that what God is doing in us is just as important as what we are asking Him to do around us.
There is mercy in the delay. There is grace in the gap between our asking and His revealing. Sometimes the waiting protects us from stepping into something too soon. Sometimes it shields others whose lives are intertwined with our story. Sometimes it allows for healing we did not know we needed. And always it creates room for intimacy, the kind that cannot be built through answers alone, but must be formed through quiet companionship. The waiting seasons are invitations. They are not empty spaces to endure, but sacred ground where trust becomes real. In the slow hours when nothing appears to move, something essential is being formed, a faith that can stand without seeing, a heart that remains tender without resolution, a soul that knows the difference between what is immediate and what is eternal. God does not rush what He loves. He crafts slowly what He intends to last. And though the waiting may ache, though the silence may stretch long, His hand remains steady, His heart remains near. And when the appointed time comes, not a moment early, not a moment late, what unfolds carries a weight of meaning that could only be born through patience. If today you find yourself in a space between prayers and fulfillment, between hope and clarity, let this truth settle into you gently. The delay is not a denial. The slowness is not a sign of forgetfulness. It is the kindness of a God who prepares things fully, who does not release what is still becoming, and who is more committed to your formation than your timeline. You are not being held back. You are being held close. And what He is preparing in silence will one day speak with beauty that only waiting could reveal.
There comes a point along the journey of faith when the need to understand begins to give way to something more lasting. At first, we seek answers with urgency, convinced that clarity will anchor us, that if only we could see the reason, the pattern, the purpose, then peace would naturally follow. And yet with time, we begin to see that the deepest peace is not born from understanding. It grows from relationship. Trust that depends on answers is fragile. It rises and falls with each change in circumstance. It wavers when explanations are slow, when outcomes differ from our expectations. But trust that is anchored in God's character, not His visible actions, carries a different weight. It does not rise and fall with emotions. It abides. It remains. Throughout Scripture, we find men and women who walked through places of mystery, not because they lacked faith, but because their faith was being refined into something more enduring. Job, who sat in the ashes with questions no one could answer, declared that he would still hope in God. Mary, who did not understand the full meaning of the angel's words, received them with quiet assent, holding them in her heart. Paul, who carried a thorn without removal, chose grace as sufficient. Their trust was not built on the presence of explanations. It was formed in the presence of God Himself, a presence that did not always explain, but never left. To trust without answers is not to abandon intelligence or ignore pain. It is to acknowledge that our vision is limited and to place our confidence in the one who sees fully. It is to live from the conviction that God is faithful even when we cannot trace His logic. It is to surrender the demand for resolution and embrace the deeper rest that comes from knowing we are held. This kind of trust matures slowly. It does not arrive through theory, but through lived experience. Through nights when prayers feel unanswered, through seasons when direction is unclear, through moments when silence stretches longer than comfort allows. It is in these places that faith stops being a framework and becomes a breath, a posture, a quiet decision to remain near, even when certainty has grown dim.
The heart learns to stop asking, "Why hasn't this changed?" and begins to ask, "What is being formed in me here?" The soul shifts from grasping to receiving, from questioning outcomes to cultivating presence. And in this shift, something holy unfolds, a faith that is not easily shaken because it rests not on circumstance, but on communion. There is a beauty in unanswered places. They create room for mystery, and mystery, when met with reverence, becomes fertile ground for trust. In that space, we begin to see that God is not a puzzle to be solved, but a presence to be encountered. And the more we dwell in that presence, the less we rely on having all the pieces in place. If today you carry a question that has lingered without reply, if your prayers continue to rise without resolution, let your soul breathe in this truth. Trust does not require full understanding to be real. It requires willingness. It requires surrender. It requires love, the kind that keeps showing up even in the silence. God is not asking you to ignore your questions. He is inviting you to bring them into relationship, not as demands, but as companions on the journey. And as you walk, you may find that the answers become less urgent, not because they no longer matter, but because the one walking with you begins to matter more. You are not failing because you don't have it all figured out. You are growing, slowly, quietly, fully, into a faith that listens more than it demands. And that kind of faith is not weak. It is the kind that holds steady when everything else begins to shift.
There is a stillness that belongs to the night, not the calm of rest, but the ache of hours that stretch long, where light feels distant and silence settles deep. These are the moments when tears fall without words, when sleep does not come easily, when the heart lies open with questions that seem too large to hold. In that quiet space, time slows, and the soul begins to wonder if morning will ever return. But even in that darkness, something ancient begins to stir, a memory deeper than fear, a whisper older than despair. It is the promise woven into the fabric of creation itself. The night is never the final word. There is always a turning, always a rising, always a dawn that waits just beyond the horizon. Scripture speaks this truth with quiet strength. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. These are not sentimental words, nor are they meant to dismiss the weight of sorrow. They carry the authority of experience, the kind that knows grief not as a stranger, but as a companion along the way. These words do not deny the night. They carry us through it. Throughout the pages of sacred story, we see this rhythm unfold. Hannah cried through long nights of barrenness before holding the child she had prayed for. David wandered through caves and exile before the throne was placed in his hands. The disciples hid in fear after the cross, unaware that resurrection was already approaching with the first light of the third day. Each of these nights held their own sorrow, but none of them lasted forever.
There is something the night teaches that daylight cannot. It slows us enough to listen. It humbles us enough to receive. It brings our rawest prayers to the surface, the ones that do not seek eloquence, but simply ask to be heard. In the dark, we learn to reach beyond what is visible, to trust in what memory holds when sight no longer serves. And it is there, in that vulnerable reaching, that God draws near with the kind of tenderness that cannot be rushed. The night is not wasted. It becomes the place where we are shaped to carry joy more fully. Joy that is not dependent on circumstance. Joy that remembers sorrow, not with bitterness, but with depth. Joy that has walked through shadows and now understands the light in a new way. Not as brightness alone, but as faithfulness revealed. Sometimes we want the morning to come quickly. We want the story to resolve, the pain to pass, the clarity to return. But God is never hurried. He does not simply pull us out of the night. He walks with us through it. And in that walking, He gives us Himself, not as an answer, but as presence, not as escape, but as sustaining love. If your night feels long, if your tears are fresh, if hope feels like a distant memory, let your heart hold gently to this truth.
The morning is already written into the design. Light has not forgotten how to return. God has not stopped watching. The sun still rises, not because we force it, but because He is faithful. You do not have to understand how or when. You only need to remain open to the turning, because the night will not last forever, and when the morning comes, it will carry a joy that knows exactly what it cost to wait.
There are moments, often subtle and unannounced, when the heart begins to look back, not with regret, but with a quiet kind of recognition. Something within you starts to trace the path you've walked, the long stretch of silence, the waiting, the nights, the questions. And in that reflection, a truth rises slowly like dawn over a landscape you've traveled in darkness. He was never far. He was near in ways you had not yet learned to see. The presence of God does not always arrive with signs that can be measured. It does not always come with the comfort of certainty or the warmth of feeling. Often it remains hidden in the ordinary, in breath, in stillness, in the quiet strength that helped you take one more step. When the noise of desperation fades, when striving gives way to rest, you begin to see that what felt like absence was filled with presence too deep for words. The disciples who walked the road to Emmaus knew something of this mystery. They spoke with Jesus, they listened, they shared the journey, and yet their eyes were kept from recognizing Him. It was only later, in the breaking of bread, that the veil lifted, and when it did, they looked at one another and said, "Did not our hearts burn within us as He talked with us on the road?" The one they longed for had been with them the entire time. This is the way He walks with us still, not always in ways we expect, but always in ways that endure. He meets us in silence, not because He is distant, but because He is inviting us to listen differently. He surrounds us in waiting, not because He is unsure, but because He is preparing something deeper than we can yet comprehend. And when we look back from a quieter place in the soul, we begin to notice the trace of His nearness in places we thought were empty.
The strength that carried you when you felt weakest, that was Him. The peace that arrived without explanation, that was Him. The moments you were upheld, though you did not understand how, that was Him too. Not beside you as a distant guide, but within you as the sustaining breath. He does not always announce His nearness with thunder. Often He comes like wind passing through trees, present, alive, gentle. And when your heart becomes still enough to notice, you begin to recognize how faithfully He has walked with you, not because you saw Him clearly, but because He never stopped seeing you. God does not wait for us to notice Him before He draws near. He does not make His love dependent on our awareness. His faithfulness does not require our certainty. While we wrestle with silence, He stays. While we ask our questions, He remains. While we ache for evidence, He surrounds us with mercies we may not yet be able to name.
If your journey has carried you through places that felt hollow, if you've questioned whether God could still be near after all that has passed, let this truth settle quietly into your soul. He was closer than you thought, not just beside you in principle, but close in compassion, close in presence, close in love. And now, as you begin to recognize His nearness, something new awakens. Not the need to understand everything, but the ability to rest in what matters most, that you have never been alone. That even in the silence, even in the struggle, even in the waiting, He was there. Steady, faithful, quietly drawing you closer through every step of the way.
If these words are finding you in a moment where your prayers rise quietly and return unanswered, if your heart feels stretched between longing and surrender, and if the silence around you has begun to settle into the corners of your soul, I want to speak to that space. Not with solutions, not with declarations, but with the kind of presence that simply sits beside you and says, I see you. I understand this place. I've walked through it too. Silence, when it lingers, can begin to sound like abandonment. It can feel like a space left vacant, like a story that stopped mid-sentence. You may be waking up each day wondering when the page will turn, when clarity will come, when the weight in your chest will begin to lift. You may be searching the sky, listening harder, holding your breath, hoping that today something will shift. If that's where you are, please hear this with gentle certainty. This chapter is not outside of God's care. The quiet is not a sign that you have been forgotten. It is not proof that you are doing something wrong. It is not the absence of love. You are not lost. You are not left behind. You are not alone in the stillness. What you are walking through, this slow, unspoken unfolding, holds its own kind of holiness. It may not sparkle with revelation or pulse with divine activity, but it is sacred nonetheless. Because in this place, something is being planted. Something real. Something that words cannot give and noise cannot produce. You are being formed for something more enduring than emotional certainty. You are being held through something more intimate than answers.
God does not measure you by how vibrant your faith feels today. He does not step away when you feel empty. He does not require eloquence to remain close. His love is steady in the silence. His nearness does not depend on your awareness. And while you may be longing for the sound of His voice, He may already be speaking through the strength that helps you rise again, through the quiet courage it takes to hope anyway, through the stillness that deepens rather than destroys. Let your breath slow. Let your striving rest. You do not have to earn your way out of this season. You do not have to explain it, justify it, or understand it fully. You only have to remain present, as you are, with the one who is still here. If your words have grown quiet, if your prayers now feel more like sighs than sentences, know this: He hears them all. He receives them not as weakness, but as intimacy. And every tear, every silence, every whispered plea, they are all gathered into the heart of a God who knows exactly how to be with you in the middle of everything you cannot explain. One day, the silence will give way to sound. The dawn will stretch across this long night. And when it does, you will not only hear Him more clearly, you will know Him more deeply. But until then, may this truth stay with you like a hand over yours in the dark. You are being carried, even now, even here.
There are moments when the soul reaches toward heaven, not with polished phrases, but with open hands. Words, once plentiful, grow still. Thoughts, once full of direction, now pause in the presence of something deeper. In that quiet, prayer no longer sounds like speaking. It begins to feel like resting, not because we have given up, but because we have come closer, closer to the one who hears even what is never spoken aloud. If you are in that space now, where silence has become the language of your faith, let this be a prayer for you, not to add noise, but to give shape to the stillness you already carry. Lord, you know me better than I know myself. You see the thoughts I cannot name, the feelings that rise without invitation, the questions I have stopped trying to answer. And still, you remain. I have come to you today, not to perform, but to be. I have come with hands that are tired of holding, with a heart that carries more than it understands. I do not ask for clarity before I ask for you. Let your presence be enough for me here. Teach me how to listen beneath the surface, where fear does not shout and striving does not lead. Help me to notice the way you speak through peace, through breath, through the quiet unfolding of a day I did not plan. I do not need to see the whole road. I only ask for light enough to stay near. I offer you the parts of me I do not know how to fix, the weariness I cannot explain, the emptiness that visits without warning, the places where I still feel unseen. Wrap your mercy around them like morning light, gentle, slow, and faithful. If you speak in whispers, then make my soul quiet enough to hear. If you move slowly, then help me wait without fear. If you are hidden in this stillness, then teach me how to stay long enough to find you there.
not because I have the strength, but because you do. I do not come to you as one who knows the answers. I come as one who trusts your hands more than my own. Let this quiet become the place where our hearts meet, not in the resolution of every question, but in the presence that has never left me, not for a moment. You are God in the silence, as surely as you are God in the song. And I am yours.
Amen.